What's up everyone, it's Endymion. In this video, I will be diving into the depths of Elden Ring and trying to explain the many highs and some very questionable lows in what will likely be my longest critique yet. Of course, spoilers for Elden Ring and to a lesser extent the majority of Soulsborne games. And before I begin, if you like the video, consider subscribing and sharing it to give my life meaning. And hit the bell to be notified of future uploads. And I apologize in advance for how many times I'm going to say Elden Ring in this critique. Now let's begin the journey of deciphering the biggest game in recent memory. Firstly, it's important that we try to understand what exactly From Software and the director of Elden Ring wanted from this experience. Elden Ring was designed from the start to encompass all the design philosophies of the Dark Souls series while translating those mechanics into an open world setting. Elden Ring feels like the greatest hits collection of all of these influences woven into a dark fantasy game. It started development in 2017, shortly after the Ring City was finished, and was also developed alongside Sekiro as well. Elden Ring's world was designed to be enormous, and once you've played it, it wouldn't be crazy to think that every single other From Software game could fit into Elden Ring's world and then some. It's truly a massive game. It was also the first game From Software had made with the help of an outside author in the form of George R.R. Martin, the dude who wrote A Song of Ice and Fire. Martin would be seen as the dungeon master in a sense, creating the principles and background lore that the world would abide by. Even though confirmed to be purely coincidence, it is kind of hilarious that basically every demigod in the game shares initials with George as well. From Godric to Radon to Morgot and so on. But it's apparently pure coincidence. Sure, we believe you, George, you totally didn't do that on purpose. The three core pillars of Elden Ring during its massive 5 years of development were role-playing mechanics, storytelling, and environmental scale as the core fundamentals that would drive the world forward. This would result in a gaming experience that was both massive in not only size but depth as well, leading to ridiculously high Metacritic scores in the process. But now that we have the basics down, it's time to dive into why Elden Ring is so universally acclaimed by mostly everyone. And it's all about that magical first step into its world. In my opinion, having played and 100%ed every single Soulsborne game up until this point, I would have to say that Elden Ring's first playthrough is about as close to magical as it gets in modern gaming. Not only is the world just ridiculous in size, but it's the mechanics and also the lack of other core mechanics that makes its world so endearing and thrilling to explore. In most open world games, you're thrown within a game space where your entire experience is guided by various icons on your map. Games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, even tell you what you're going to discover before you even get there, which basically removes any sense of discovery from exploring. In Elden Ring, it's one of the only games I can truly say works better because of its lack of core mechanics that other games use. Instead of flooding your screen with information, the developers instead focus on delivering interesting moments and landmarks that are not only distinguishable, but interesting, which promotes exploration without the need for hand-holding like most other open-world games. Combine this with its actual dire world design, and that's why so many people love this game, and to a further extent, Soulsborns or Souls-likes in general. Most of these open-world games have repetitive tasks where you feel more like you're cleaning up a map or going through the motions as you go from place to place. In Elden Ring, you rarely ever feel safe for long. Besides the sites of graces, generally speaking, you could basically die at any moment. And it's because of this sense of danger that I would wager that the majority of players who experienced Elden Ring actually were alert and engaged the majority of their playtime. The game also does something that many other open world games don't do, and that's build actual dungeons into their world's level layout. The recycled feel of open world games comes from the fact that every base, town, or cave are generally for the most part the same. And while Elden Ring's caves to some degree also share this laziness, it makes up for this by having actual levels that act more like giant haunted houses, full of crazy stuff than flat land and boring camps to clear like other games. And the game's world is beautifully segmented by these legacy dungeons where each act like they were levels ripped right out of Dark Souls. Why I love this can be easily explained with that moment where once you survive Stormveil Castle and overcome it, you exit only to be greeted by the vast misty region of Liurnia. And I love how the Academy of Raya Lucaria is in view at all times when you're here. And once you explore the open world and find a glintstone key, you can enter Raya Lucaria and discover an enormous level full of scale and horrors that puts anything any other open world game has done up until this point to shame in terms of level design and scale. I know I shouldn't be crapping on other games as much as I do when I talk about games like Elden Ring, but it's really hard not to. Look, I love games like Insomniac's Spider-Man, but even that game has some samey open world mission design too. The thing is, when I play most open world games, I kind of already know what to expect. But when it comes to Elden Ring, I genuinely don't know what I'll run into. I could just be minding my own business when a dragon decides it wants to eat me, or how whether I cross certain bridges at day or night will mean the difference between me crossing safely or having a surprise boss fight in my way. What I'm trying to say is that Elden Ring feels like an actual evolution of the open world genre. The fact that when you really look at its map, you don't have to engage with maybe 70% if not more of it in order to complete it. I mean, realistically, you could go from Stormveil to Raya Lucaria straight to Lendale and then go and finish the game. Actually, I don't even think you need to finish Stormveil at all either. Meaning the entire southern part of Limgrave, not to mention the entire region of Caelid or the underground map sections, are completely unnecessary and totally optional. It's here where one of those core mechanics of Elden Ring's design really shines, which is environmental scale. This game is not only huge, but also extremely tall and full of secrets. Hidden caves or towers with weird riddles waiting to be solved, or bosses tucked away in random corners of the map, or side quests that lead to the literal game world changing due to your actions, which is amazing. I know I'm not the only one whose jaw dropped when they went underground for the first time and realized that the elevator just kept going. And then you see stars and realize there's an entire underground world to explore. It really is because of moments like these that they shape Elden Ring's journey into becoming easily the most enjoyable, especially for a first-time playthrough. And the genius design decision to not show the entire map from the get-go just added to that spectacle. I thought the map was going to be Limgrave and maybe Caelid and that's it, until I got to Liurnia and saw how vast it was. Then I looked up and noticed how there seemed to be a whole region above that. Then I reached Lendale and thought surely this is the end, it has to be. But it just kept going. And that's a feeling I don't see being replicated anywhere else in gaming. At all. Most open world games, you can open the map and see everything from the get-go, which is fine I guess, but I have a feeling most AAA games will be adopting a lot of Elden Ring's mechanics going further, whether they want to or not, especially the Western-made games. While a lot of open worlds feel samey and flat in terms of how you traverse, it makes moments like crossing the giant stone bridge, for example, super cool in comparison. Like, they could have just made this a flat surface bridge or something and be done with it. But no, they wanted to make it rigid, epic to look at, and of course make it just big enough, but also small enough that if you screw up a jump, you'd plummet to your death. There's also giant chains you can cross too, which I mean, they've done that before, but it's always cool. It's this sense of verticality and making the world actually feel like a level that keeps evolving instead of just flat fields with the occasional bump in the road somewhere. I know I sound a bit jaded when it comes to open world design, but it's because so many of these games feel the same. At the very least, Elden Ring tries to incorporate actual level design into its world, and while I'm not saying games like Valhalla or even Cyberpunk are bad because they don't do this, it does make them less interesting to traverse because it's very samey in general. I think my favorite level in the entire journey was Lendale. Just the fact you were given this big abandoned city full of bubble boys, omen dudes, and a gigantic dead dragon that you can climb was so cool. If there's any level in Elden Ring where I go googly-eyed every time I enter it, it's Lendale. What a beautiful level. Beyond all this praise, I want to also quickly go over some gameplay mechanics and quality of life changes that I really love. I love how you can teleport from anywhere whenever you want. I love how you can scale almost every weapon with almost any stat you want as well, which means finally if you wanted to play a mage character but use a spear or a two-handed sword or I don't know, a hammer, you could make it work for your build. I love how when you kill all the enemies in a group, your flasks replenish a bit, which encourages further exploration. I know Elden Ring got this from Dark Souls 3, and yes, it's a great change to the formula. I also almost forgot to mention the two biggest changes being that you can jump now, which had to be influenced by Sekiro since they were both developed alongside one another, and how jumping allows for more complex and fun level design as well. And of course, there's Torrent, your trusty steed who opens up the world map to even more discovery. I do wish we could customize Torrent. I want to paint his fur and put some cool stuff on him. Also, still annoyed you can't ride Torrent in the final fight, but we'll get to what I dislike about this game later on in the video. To finish off with this section, the reason why Elden Ring is so critically acclaimed is because it treats its player base with respect. Most games these days, especially in the AAA space, treat their fans more like lost puppies and look for any way they can monetize their games further. Elden Ring has a ridiculous amount of weapons, armor, spells, and if it were any other AAA game, a good 50 to even 70% of those weapons would be removed only to be placed behind some arbitrary paywall to incentivize more spending. It's actually insane when you really look at Elden Ring's gameplay options and compare it to what else is out there. I mean, in Horizon Forbidden West, your only melee weapon is your spear, and it has a few animation attacks, and that's it apart from some one-and-done skills. But when you look at Elden Ring, it has swords, greatswords, spears, hammers, axes, katanas, claws, staves, ultra greatswords, and more. Not to mention their secondary functions where some allow for you to buff yourself or blast giant explosions or even teleport. I mean, it's ridiculous. We really shouldn't take Elden Ring's weapon variety for granted because it is clearly not the standard when it comes to the industry at large. This level of variety, not even including spells, is more gameplay variety than most gaming franchises will have in not one, but even multiple games. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it. When you combined it all from the massive world full of things to explore to the interwoven legacy dungeon designs and the stupid amounts of gameplay variety just in your weapons or spells, Elden Ring really is eons ahead of its competition already. And I know that sounds fanboyish, but seriously, name me one other open world game with as many weapons or spells that has the same or more variety than Elden Ring in terms of animations, unique skills tied to certain weapons, and more. I don't think it exists. From Software could have easily have taken half or more of these weapons and paywalled them. And to a majority of the players out there, that would look normal in comparison to other games. That needs to be applauded. I mean, it's sad that it has to be since it should be the standard, but it isn't. And it's because of this level of depth, scope, and variety that when compared to other AAA games, whether they're RPGs, open worlds, or whatever else, it becomes really difficult to go back to them after playing Elden Ring. But I also want to dissect something that's been annoying me forever. Elden Ring has this weird way of displaying its accessories, they're called talismans, by giving you these really vague explanations. A lot of these item descriptions have these mysterious texts that don't actually tell you what you need to know. Like, for example, Godfrey's icon says, enhances charge spells and skills. Okay, but how much does it charge? Like, percentage-wise, what are we talking? 15%, 25, 50? There's no way to really know. Even when you use it, you don't have the exact numbers. This same bizarre item description laziness continues with other talismans. The Axe talisman says, enhances charge attacks. Right, okay, but how much does it enhance? This continues with certain talismans that just have bizarrely specific effects, like the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, which says, poisoning or rot in vicinity increases attack power. But how much attack though? Can I have numbers? How close do I have to be to Scarlet Rot to make this happen? This weird way of saying what items do doesn't end there, with other talismans like Radagon's icon saying, Shorten spellcasting time. Like, for the love of God, can someone please just add a screen in-game that tells me what these do specifically? Like raw data, please, I'm begging you. I want to sit Miyazaki down and just ask him these questions because they're mysterious for no reason. This is a game about build crafting, deep RPG mechanics, and stats having a direct effect on what you can and cannot use. Yet I'm supposed to equip talismans that say stuff like extends special effect duration or enhances stamina reducing attacks against blockers. How much stamina do they lose? What are we talking about here? I want to ask Miyazaki and be like, what do you mean by enhances charge attacks? Well, if you read here, it says it enhances them. By how much though? By enhancing them. This one says it raises my attack when my equipment load is lower, but by how much? It raises it when you're lighter. What does that mean, Miyazaki? Raises it by how much? When you're lighter. Oh my god. Anyway, enough about playing detective with talismans, cause maybe I'm the only one who hates that we can't see raw data in a game all about raw data having an impact on everything, but let's just keep moving. And now I want to speak about one of the big draws of this entire genre, and that is, of course, the bosses. The bosses of Elden Ring are a mixed bag of both amazing achievements of game design and frustration. If I could compare Elden Ring to any other From Software game in terms of its bosses, it would be at times like Dark Souls 3, but also a lot like Dark Souls 2. And if you know me and have seen my critique of Dark Souls 2, you know how I feel about that game. Elden Ring does have a lot of repeats in the boss space from many different dragons who, to be fair, at least some of those dragons have unique moves. And then there's the Erdtree avatars, which are just reskins of the Asylum Demon from Dark Souls. Bet you can't unsee that one now. But where I really couldn't excuse Dark Souls 2 for reusing its assets so much, it makes more sense that it would happen in Elden Ring. That doesn't mean, however, that I'm fully okay with it. Dark Souls 2 was a pretty linear game, and even though it was decent in size, repeating bosses like Dragon Rider or having rooms of enemies as a boss cause there's a health bar was really lazy. Unfortunately, when it comes to open world games, even Elden Ring isn't free of the common shortcomings of this genre. Open world games are, well, big, obviously. They're massive sprawling worlds full of content. Or as I like to put it, open world games are usually quantity over quality in many regards. This design decision to have a huge game world will inevitably lead to developers having to make sacrifices in order to populate their worlds. Of course, some franchises in this genre do it extremely lazy, like Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and while Elden Ring does have repeated bosses here and there, thankfully it does have a core of bosses that mostly don't get used more than once. Nah, mostly. The first true big shard bearer of the game most players will likely face first is Godric, and in my opinion, Godric is kind of the peak of Elden Ring's bosses. One of the things I hate about games are when bosses punish players for choosing to play one way over another, like magic over melee. A good example would be Aldia in Dark Souls 2. He can light himself on fire, which does damage to players who use melee as their primary way to fight. But if you play as a mage, this mechanic is pointless and you're fine. So Aldia by design punishes one group of players more than others, which means Aldia is by definition bad game design in my opinion. Godric on the other hand is about as perfect as you can get in this game. All of his attacks are well telegraphed, and his style of fighting complements really any type of player. You can fight him with whatever and it all works, and Godric's mechanics allows players to express themselves while keeping the fight engaging. This isn't easy to do clearly, and Godric is kind of a perfect boss when you really start to take a critical eye to him. He has attacks that vary in distance, and eventually he gets wounded enough that he grafts a dragon head to his arm, and now the fight becomes even more fun and dynamic. I have literally, I'm not kidding, zero complaints when it comes to Godric. He is the gold standard for what a boss fight should be. He's thrilling, he's challenging but fair, and his kit works perfectly with whatever style you choose to play. He is absolutely a standout boss fight, and this is a fight developers should study. He's that good. Unfortunately, Godric leaves such a good impression that anything following him doesn't quite live up in comparison. Next we have Ronala, who I still find to be a good fight. Her first form is weird because we're technically cutting down children to get to her, and it has that Deacons of the Deep feel to it where you have to keep your eye on where the essence goes in order to hurt the boss, so it's not brain dead at least. Then the next phase is this really fun battle where Ronala starts blasting you with powerful sorceries as you close the distance to smack her. Again, Ronala is a solid fight, and her mechanics don't really punish any one style of player. She's viable regardless of how you play, and this is a good thing. Also, I like her hat, reminds me of a certain kind of snack. Anyway, next I want to look at Radon, who many consider to be their favorite boss in this game. If you've watched my previous critiques, I have 3 criteria as to whether a boss is good or not. The first is gameplay mechanics, then music, and finally lore. Radon knocks all of these out of the park. Usually I hate the idea of summoning others to help me, but in terms of Radon, From Software found a way to make the summoning mechanic both fun as hell to witness and make sense lore-wise. See, Radon is the Incredible Hulk armed with gigantic gravity swords, and it's awesome. He's a crazy strong badass general who's so powerful that his soldiers contract any heroes or warriors willing to face the challenge of finally putting their lord to rest. And so when you summon a bunch of dudes to help you and you see them all rushing Radon alongside you, it's really cool because lore-wise it makes sense. This is supposed to be a guy who's so strong no one person can defeat him. Well, until New Game Plus runs, I guess. But you get what I'm saying. So his attacks are meant to be big and epic as he sweeps from side to side, downing warriors as your company of heroes slowly diminish with every Giga Slash. This is super cool. It feels like an actual raid boss in like an MMO or something. And I love how he eventually yeets his ass into the sky and comes crashing down like a meteor, which just adds to the spectacle. Honestly, outside of Godric, Radon may be one of my other favorite fights in the game. Plus, he has this stupid looking pathetic horse he rides, and it just looks hilarious. I love this guy. I don't really have any complaints about Radon. He's just fun as hell and easily one of the standouts of this game. Of course, there's other bosses as well, from Lich Dragon Fortisax, who really, when you take a critical eye to his fight, he's quite literally just Dark Eater Midir from Dark Souls 3, but weaker. He even stands up the same way and has attack patterns similar to Midir, but even outside of the Midir comparisons, Fortisax is just a black-colored Faramazula dragon basically, which, again, is fine, but once you notice these things, it kinda makes his fight less exciting in my opinion. Then there's one of the best gimmick bosses in the series with Reichard. While he shares a lot with Yorm in terms of how the fight works, the spectacle more than makes up for it. Unfortunately for me, every time I've fought Reichard, something weird has happened and his fight just doesn't work properly. As you can see here, he just sort of stands still as I wail on him with the gimmick weapon. This isn't the first boss to do this to me either, with Placidusax also just not working near the midpoint of his fight. This is footage from my very first playthrough, and he just stops moving. That's not to say Placidusax isn't a fun fight. It is. But I've honestly never ran into the amount of bugs in Elden Ring compared to any of FromSoft's previous works. I've had little glitches, of course, but never full-blown bosses just cease to function. There's also the return of annoying human NPC fights here as well. I mean, Dark Souls has a style of fight too, but in Elden Ring's case, one of these fights is just annoying. And that fight is with Gideon, who is just a spam fest of spells. Like, as you can see, this dude is just spamming the same spells over and over again with barely any downtime. I always found this fight to also be weird, and it's more of an annoyance than a true boss in my opinion, but it's not exactly engaging. I'll get more into my problems with Elden Ring in the next section, don't you worry. One fight I loved was Estelle, who I still think lore-wise is one of the most interesting things about this game. I joked with other content creators that I think Estelle looks like the skeleton of John Malkovich, which I can't explain, but it just makes sense to me, and I love the spectacle to this fight. The fact it's this blood-borne Lovecraft alien monster thing that looks like a psychedelic centipede human butterfly thing, it's kinda cool. Its attacks are also a lot of fun. It's a little tricky as a melee character, but nevertheless, Estelle is amazing. It does look like John Malkovich's skeleton though. There's also a boss that felt more tacky than anything in the form of Commander Nile. For some reason, this guy summons 2 banished knights alongside him, probably incentivizing players to use their summon ash, which I ignored because that's stupid, and really outside of his friends helping him, Nile is fine on his own. I don't really know why From Software felt that Nile needed backup in the first place. He hits decently hard as it is, and his attacks while damaging also have plenty of space for counters. This fight gave me Dark Souls 2 flashbacks, which is never a good thing. It's an okay fight, it's more a stepping stone to getting to Haligtree if anything. Finally, I want to speak about another standout, and that's Morgot. Morgot and his weaker version Morgot are probably another set of fights in this game that come close to being perfect. Not to mention how good the lore behind Morgot is, but his fighting style is so unique, and whether you're fighting him at Stormvale or Lendale, you're in for a hell of a fight. I love how he feels like he was tested rigorously by the developers to ensure that his mechanics and area would work with any playstyle. I love how he's this grotesque omen who can summon the powers of the golden lineage in the form of magical blades and spears, and how his sword attacks feel so cool to dodge. But more than anything, it's that Morgot feels fair. And in my opinion, everything in Elden Ring from the start of the game until the end of Lendale, with it ending with Morgot, feels like this nice, logical, gradual climb in difficulty and complexity. The closest I can compare the boss quality and difficulty curve of the game up until Lendale would be to compare it to Dark Souls 3. In my opinion, Dark Souls 3 is probably the most balanced and fair experience From Software has ever made. Every boss feels like it adds onto and increases the difficulty as you go on. Apart from the Deacons of the Deep, which of course isn't really a boss fight in my opinion, every other boss never feels unfair or invalidating of any particular playstyle. From beginning to really its end, Dark Souls 3 feels perfectly paced and very well balanced. That's how I would mostly describe Elden Ring from its beginning to the end of Lendale. You're probably wondering why I haven't spoken about bosses like Malekith or Millennia in the boss section here. Well, that's cause I'm saving them for the next section. So, get comfy because enough about Elden Ring's rights, it's time to talk about Elden Ring's wrongs. There is a term about whether a product is able to cohesively take every part of its experience and capitalize on it within its final act. This is called the landing. Whether something sticks this landing, however, seems to be much harder than we think, as there's countless shows, movies, books, or games you or I could think of off the top of our head that miss it when it comes to their conclusions. An example for me would be Batman Arkham Knight, as I found that game's ending very underwhelming. Elden Ring, unfortunately, is another experience I would argue also doesn't stick its landing. Like I said earlier, Elden Ring's difficulty curve and overall experience is pretty solid from the beginning all the way until the end of Lendale. But after this point, which I would call the final act of the game from the Forbidden Lands all the way to the final boss, has to be one of the most maddeningly frustrating sections in From Software history for me. It's not only that areas like the mountaintop of the giants are just way too big, it really comes down to the bosses and the skyrocketing increase in difficulty they have that isn't present prior to this. Morgot and everything before him felt balanced. Of course, Soulsborne games have varying levels of difficulty spikes, but whereas maybe Sekiro might be harder or easier depending on who you ask, it almost seems that everyone in the community can agree that Elden Ring's final stretch is wildly imbalanced. We go from bosses that are perfectly good and fair like Godric or Ronala to bosses like Malekith and the Godskin duos who were capable of deleting you in mere seconds. This increase in difficulty starts to not only lessen the experience, but start to show the warts underneath Elden Ring's complexion. For example, we have the totally optional area of the consecrated snowfields, which reminds me a little too much of Elam Lois's snowfields in Dark Souls 2, which is not a good thing if you've experienced that place. It's just vast, empty, and generally speaking, it's not very fun to navigate. There's a semi-annoying puzzle town which leads you to Haligtree, which is one of the best areas in the game and houses some really annoying enemies. Haligtree is like if Anne Orlando got bukkake'd on by Blighttown and nobody cleaned up the mess for like 1,000 years. It's this beautiful level with actually quite interesting level design that's undermined by annoying enemies like the pests that continuously shoot darts, or the hallway full of revenants, which are some of the worst enemies in the game due to how they can teleport, puke poison, and swarm you with their little gross human baby arms. I hate these guys. Then we have the major boss of this place, which is Millennia. How a character that looks so cool can be so annoying to fight is beyond me. Millennia emphasizes all the best and worst game design decisions in a single boss better than any other. She hits obscenely hard, can heal herself when she hits you, and can kill you in a matter of seconds. This mantra of dying almost instantly isn't unique to Millennia, as other endgame bosses like Malekith, for example, can literally delete your existence in a matter of seconds as well. There just seems to be a bizarre imbalance to Elden Ring's final act that doesn't really exist in anything preceding Lindell. It's like From Software had a staff party and an intern got drunk and started messing with a difficulty curve and no one noticed. You go from being able to overcome encounters and survive within reason to basically, if you don't immediately throw everything you have at endgame enemies, you will just die within seconds. The Revenants are a really good example of this. If you don't immediately rush them with all you got, you're as good as dead. The bosses are the same way it seems in the endgame. If you watched my top 10 hardest Soulsborne bosses video, Millennia is unsurprisingly number 1. I explained in that video that Millennia feels like she should be in Sekiro instead of Elden Ring with how she operates. Her waterfowl dance, for example, largely doesn't make sense when it comes to how Elden Ring as a game operates with combat. Waterfowl dance is able to hit in front, beside, behind, and above you within milliseconds. In a game like Sekiro, I could see this move being countered by the parry mechanic as you feverishly deflect every blow with pinpoint precision. But in Elden Ring, it becomes a move you either survive due to sheer luck or die almost instantly to most of the time. But beyond her insane, overpowered signature move, Millennia also has 2 health bars and can cause massive Scarlet Rot damage as well, which if you've played this game, you know Scarlet Rot is like toxic on steroids. But this is all capped off by Millennia being able to heal herself as she hits you. So the longer the fight goes on, and the more mistakes you make, the less progress you've basically made. Millennia is simply From Software turning the dials of difficulty way too far up in my opinion. There has never been, and I hope there will never be, a boss that tops Millennia in terms of difficulty in any future game. But really, this uneven difficulty spike goes beyond Millennia and her BS with bosses like the Godskin duos. This is by far the worst duo fight in From Software history because nothing these two do complements one another's mechanics. It's just a chaotic mess of spam attacks where even when one of these idiots die, they come back a second time. So you have to kill these dudes a total of 4 times combined to end the fight. That's ridiculous. But I think the thing I dislike the most about Elden Ring, besides bosses who heal or wildly unbalanced duo fights, is the one mechanic it felt like From Software had to add due to outside criticism, and that's Spirit Summon Ashes. Here is where I'm going to give my hottest take of the video, so please enjoy, and also let me know what you think in the comments about this too. Okay, look, I get it, not everybody can rise to the difficulty of a FromSoft game. However, I think adding mechanics like this to satisfy those people doesn't help the game either. What ends up happening is because such a mechanic is so readily available to the player, From Software had to find a way to balance that extra helping hand. And that's why I think the final act of Elden Ring is so much harder and honestly inferior to the rest of the game. It almost feels mandatory for some fights, like Godskin Duo for example, that you have to summon a spirit to help you in order to balance that fight out. While I get that spirits are meant to help those who aren't as skilled at the game, it really is a mechanic that hurts the game and more importantly the player in the long run. Because when you're facing a boss in a 1v1, you have no choice but to learn the boss's mechanics. You have to understand their animations, their tells, when to dodge, when to attack, play the game for real. When you summon a Spirit Ash, not only does it make every fight wildly easier, it doesn't encourage players to learn anything about the boss mechanics in order to win. Instead, players just summon their spirits and let it grab aggro, and then the player just spams attacks while the spirit tanks every hit. That doesn't feel good, nor does it feel rewarding. You're not learning anything, you're playing a passive role in what should be the most engaging part of a game like Elden Ring. And because this mechanic is so easily available, From Software probably realized their endgame bosses were getting melted because of this and cranked the damage and difficulty in order to compensate for it. So now what you have is this endgame scenario where bosses hit like freight trains out of nowhere, and if you don't use spirits in these battles, it's like you're fighting with both hands tied behind your back and making the fight harder for trying to play it solo. Really, every endgame boss feels wildly overpowered for no other reason than because Spirit Summon Ashes exist, and therefore had to be changed for it. Godfrey hits so hard that even at 70 vigor, I'm still taking concerning amounts of damage per hit. When have we ever needed to have a 60 plus stat in health in any previous game? It's like it's mandatory if you want to even hope to survive anything in the endgame, which is so bizarre. I can imagine it's even worse for Magic players because they need to invest so heavily into mind and mana in order to play how they want that their health isn't nearly as high as they'd like it to be. So I would wager that most Magic players likely felt it was necessary to summon a spirit to help them, or their builds were basically useless because it would take one hit from any of these bosses to end them. So what's the solution here? What do we do about Spirit Summon Ashes and the end game difficulty spike? How do we make Elden Ring's final act stick the landing like previous games? Well, I have some ideas. Firstly, and this will probably be unpopular, but I think Spirit Summon Ashes should have a timer for how long they can be active for. I don't think you should be able to summon a mimic of yourself who does everything exactly as you do, and have it stay alive as long as the boss doesn't kill it. That's just stupid. This disincentivizes players into having to understand bosses and generally just makes the player fulfill a passive role in a game where they are literally the main character. If the timer is too brutal for some, then summoning a spirit should have some cost beyond a little bit of health which can be immediately fixed. There needs to be some sort of substantial cost to summoning these things. Otherwise, it's just a no-brainer broken mechanic that trivializes the large majority of boss encounters, and punishes players who want to play solo because the developers feel obligated to cater to everyone equally, when in reality it does anything but that. This is why I love games like Sekiro, because the only way forward is through learning and your skill as a player. Elden Ring feels like both the easiest and most frustrating game in From Software's history because its core philosophies are wrestling constantly for this middle ground that doesn't really exist. This is why you have bosses like Malekith who do insane amounts of damage, and they can reduce your HP and do damage over time. He wouldn't need these mechanics if Spirit Summon Ashes didn't exist. But because they do and they're so easily available, Malekith needs these gimmicks to stand a chance against the player and their mimic, otherwise it's game over for the Black Blade. In previous Soulsborne games, when you summon somebody, the boss gets stronger, gains more health, and in general becomes beefier to accommodate the extra player. I kinda wondered if Elden Ring did this, and so I tried experimenting. So here I am fighting Godfrey solo near the end of the game. As you can see, I'm dual wielding great swords, and when I hit Godfrey, it does around 1400-ish damage, which is close to maybe 10% of his overall health bar with one attack. This damage feels good to do. It feels like I'm actually making progress in the fight regardless of Godfrey being an absolute monster to fight. Notice how I have to actually engage with his mechanics, I have to learn his tells, I get punished when I make mistakes, and I take unreal damage in return for it. This is a fight where two individuals are fighting to the death, and it feels like it. Now let's see the same fight, but this time I summon my mimic. Now the fight has completely changed for all the wrong reasons. Godfrey is now no longer targeting me and is instead fighting my mimic. At this point, as the player, I am no longer playing a central role in a pivotal boss fight, but I am now the bystander. Now when I hit Godfrey with the same attack with the same weapon combo, the damage is the exact same, but it seems like I'm taking away maybe 7 to 8% of his health bar instead of 10% like before. So summoning a mimic of myself barely disadvantages me in this fight. For a measly 2% reduction in damage, I am freely able to ignore core gameplay mechanics, environmental hazards, and I don't even need to learn the boss fight in order to win. I can simply stay behind the boss or further away if I want to and simply spam my strongest attacks without worry. This feels awful, and I would wager the majority of players out there who defeated Godfrey on their first run, or Malekith or the Godskin duo, hell even Radon or the Elden Beast, they probably used Spirit Summon Ashes because there was quite literally no downside to it. And if they didn't use it, it felt like they were being punished for not doing so because the bosses were hitting them as if they had summoned a spirit anyway. So the entire final section of the game now feels uneven, and all these amazing boss fights, besides the duo because they're trash, are now reduced because you feel obligated to lessen the impact by summoning in order to win. And yet this feeling feels almost exclusive to Elden Ring. I never felt this way in any other From Software game. It's honestly like you're playing Resident Evil and the mimic in that game would be like the developers giving you a free rocket launcher shot in every boss battle. Now you don't need to use the rocket on the boss, but you know it'll do massive damage and you honestly feel like you're just disadvantaging yourself if you don't use it. And there's no penalty to using the item, so what do? The majority would simply use it cause, well, it's in the game, it's a mechanic, so why should I feel bad? And now these players have beaten Elden Ring, but the satisfaction of beating those bosses is woefully lessened cause, well, they played a passive role instead of being the focus. Really, the Spirit Summon Ashes mechanic is the worst thing From Software could ever really implement in a game like Elden Ring, and I honestly never want to see it return in any capacity in any other game. And if it does, it needs limitations. It needs to not be a potion that solves every single problem the player has. I would even like if you attacked and then it built up a bar and then you could summon your Spirit Summon Ash and it does a big attack and then it goes away. That would actually be an okay mechanic change. But due to this, that's how you build dependency and laziness in a player within a game. Why engage or learn anything when I can just ignore it and continue on regardless? And on the flip side, Spirit Summon Ashes punish players like myself because I feel like I'm just making my life harder because the bosses are kind of already designed assuming I will summon anyway. This is why every boss and really many of the enemies in the endgame feel like they're hitting with 20 to 30% more damage than they would normally do. This is why bosses have unfair mechanics like Millennia being able to heal. Because I would wager From Software looked at Millennia while designing her and realized that if players can summon their mimics, Millennia wouldn't stand a chance against the sheer firepower coming her way. So designers had to create a countermeasure to combat the Spirit Summon mechanic so the boss can still feel dire. And they did that by having her heal with every hit so she can stand a chance. And it's the same with Malekith being able to reduce your maximum HP and do damage over time and do backflips like he's Shang-Chi. It's to be a countermeasure to the Spirit Summon Ashes. Now with this revelation, the Godskin duo being able to respawn again in the fight doesn't seem that broken now. They respawn not because From Software is lazy per se, but come on, you're gonna summon your little mimic pal regardless. And these two poor bosses can't survive against you two plus whatever other help you have, so how do they try to balance it? Well, they just respawn. That'll make the extra power the player has feel more balanced, except it isn't, and it's punishing the solo players in the long run to make the experience more manageable for others. Honestly, this may be why the final boss, the Elden Beast, runs away so much and spams annoying attacks like Elden Stars. Cause if it stood still for too long, you and your mimic would delete it instantly. So its countermeasure is to run away, and that's likely why we can't use Torrent either in that fight. It's not cause From Software forgot, it would just simply make the fight too easy. Imagine if your Mimic had its own torrent. Elden Beast wouldn't stand a chance. And really this is why, I think anyway, why the final act doesn't stick the landing and why it feels so uneven. It's because FromSoft felt obligated to offer a solution to their usual game design, and all it ended up doing was offering an easy mode that doesn't really help anyone and ruins their own core fundamentals in the long run. And I would not be surprised if whatever future bosses are to come in DLC for Elden Ring, FromSoft will be forced to increase their damage, health, and ridiculous combos so it too can have a countermeasure against Spirit Summon Ashes. And that'll lessen those future bosses too, and that sucks. This is why the Spirit Summon Ashes mechanic is the worst feature in Elden Ring by a landslide. It helps too much, offers little reason to not be used, and undermines the entire game's philosophy. It's genuinely a garbage idea that punishes solo players and rewards laziness, which is the opposite of what the core community should want from Soulsborne games. At least in other Soulsbornes, if you summon someone to help you, at the very least they have reduced health and flasks to heal themselves. And the bosses do more damage, have more health, etc. But whereas that works better in say Dark Souls 3, in Elden Ring it feels like the endgame bosses are those versions of bosses where you summoned another player, but the boss is in that form regardless if you choose to summon or not. Like, does this make sense? Let me know if I'm crazy in the comments. I genuinely hope this mechanic never returns, and if it does, it needs to have trade-offs. And I don't want From Software to feel obligated to scale their bosses in dumb ways so that mechanics like summons can work. It doesn't really help anyone, and it, pun intended, tarnishes the experience. I mean, the same can even be said when fighting Morgot. When you fight his shadow form in Landel, he feels far more balanced and fair. Then you get into the endgame and surprise surprise, he's now hitting like a truck with every attack. Even Dragon Lord Placidusax hits incredibly hard as well. Well, when he's not glitched. Besides this garbage mechanic, I also never really used Elden Ring's crafting system, but maybe that's just me. It felt like it had a lot of stuff I would never really use myself, from various coatings for my weapons and bombs to throw, but these bombs don't do a whole lot of damage, but maybe if I played PvP that would matter more. But really, my faith incantations kinda did what these crafting stuff would do for me anyway, so they're kinda pointless. Maybe if I use bow and arrows, then yeah, crafting would matter more, but seeing as how I am a strength faith build, it mattered little to me, but this might be a biased opinion, of course. And earlier I did say how the first playthrough of Elden Ring is magical, however subsequent playthroughs in my opinion made Elden Ring one of the least replayable games in the series due to its size and scope. Whereas in other Souls games obtaining the items you need for builds is generally a hop or a skip through some levels, Elden Ring is so vast you have to go to various different parts of the map just to get what you need for new playthroughs. For example, just to get access to certain spells, you have to find Selin, who's decently far from the start, not to mention anything else you need. And weirdly, unlike in previous games where you meet vendors and have them conveniently teleport back to home base for you, in Elden Ring people like Selin stay where they are. I mean, you could just kill these people and get their bearings, but that's not really a cool solution in my opinion either. Which just feels like busy work in the long run when you need stuff, but I digress. Man, I have been talking a lot, have I? What else is there to complain about? Let me see. I mean, I hear that PvP is in dire straits, but some of my friends are making a PvP improvement project like Amir and Ziostorm, so I don't really need to speak much about it since they got it covered. But I hear that PvP is a mess, but again, I don't really play it. I value my sanity and my blood pressure being within acceptable levels, so I'd rather stay away from it, thanks. Alright, let's end this. Despite the flaws that tarnish the experience, Elden Ring is still at its core a wonderful game everyone should experience at least once. While it may have some of the genre's most infuriating and questionable design decisions in the late game, and it may not stick its landing, the journey is still one worth taking. Elden Ring rose to meteoric success amidst one of the most prolific launches in modern gaming history. It sold more copies in 1 month than the entire lifetime sales of previous games from the same developer, and it even outsold Call of Duty, which is amazing. And while it's not my favorite Soulsborne game ever made, I can still acknowledge how transformative it will be for the industry, as the influence of Elden Ring will shape how we interact with open world games moving forward. Millennia is still ass, the Godskin duo are garbage, and I hate Spirit Summon Ashes, but even then I would consider Elden Ring an incredible game. It's an experience about the journey and works as an incredible blend of all the various elements of From Software's storied history. It may not be the best game ever made, but Elden Ring is, at its core, one of the finest modern games in existence. Oh my god, that was a lot of talking. Well, that was fun to do. I hope you enjoyed my critique on Elden Ring. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and subscribe, share, and like the video to give my life meaning. Oh my god, my throat hurts, my shoulders are so stiff. You guys don't understand how, this recording thing is my least favorite part of making the video, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Anyway, thanks to my patrons as always, and I'm Endymion. More is on the way. Some stuff you may not expect, but I hope you look forward to it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go stare into the sun or pass out. I don't know, actually, my back is actually killing me right now. Oh my god, my shoulders are so stiff from being crouched over, reading stuff off the laptop. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.